In the heart of modern Spain, where tourists now gather under sunlit plazas and gaze at Gothic cathedrals, lies a forgotten memory, buried beneath centuries of conquest, rewritten texts, and deliberate silence. Few visitors to, or Granada, realize that they are walking over the ruins of a civilization that once rivaled the greatest empires of its time. The city of Ip's capital boasted streetlights, running water, and libraries that dwarfed the rest of Christian Europe. Muslim, Jewish, and Christian communities coexisted in a fragile but remarkable harmony. This convivencia, as it has been romanticized, allowed for an intellectual and artistic explosion. Philosophers like Ibn Rushd and emerged from this milieu, scholars who would influence both Islamic and Christian worlds. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, poetry, and philosophy found fertile ground in this multi-religious soil. According to UNESCO and the writings of historians like Richard Fletcher, held over 70 public libraries and more than 400,000 volumes in its central library at a time when the largest library in Christian Europe had barely 400 manuscripts. The streets were paved and lit, with public baths and sophisticated infrastructure that would not be seen in parts of Europe for centuries. This was Al-Andalus, a beacon of science, art, tolerance, and spiritual depth that flourished under Muslim rule for over 7 centuries. And yet, most history books offer it no more than a fleeting mention, a footnote in Europe's long tale of kings and wars. But this is no ordinary omission. This is erasure, the systematic dismantling of memory, the deliberate burial of a legacy that once made Europe shine. It began in 711 CE, when Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber general under the Umayyad, crossed the narrow strait that would later bear his name Gibraltar, or Jabelt. With a small force of around 12,000 men, he launched a campaign that would topple the Visigothic kingdom and usher in an era unlike any the Iberian Peninsula had ever seen. Within a few years, Muslim forces had swept across most of present-day Spain and Portugal, establishing a territory that came to be known as a For centuries, it would be a land of stunning contradiction, where minarets stood beside cathedrals, and Hebrew scholars debated in Arabic under the protective umbrella of Islamic law. At its zenith in the 10th century, Al-Andalus was a jewel in the crown of the Islamic world. But Al-Andalus was more than just science and architecture. It was a cultural symphony. Yet, despite all this, Al-Andalus began to fade not just politically, but from memory. The Reconquista, a centuries-long campaign by Christian kingdoms to retake Iberia, did not just aim to reclaim land, it aimed to reshape identity. Starting in the north and slowly pressing southward, Christian forces retook cities like Toledo in 1080, Córdoba in 1236, and finally Granada in 1490, to the last Muslim stronghold. With each conquest came not only the destruction of mosques and libraries, but also the rewriting of history. After 1492, under Ferdinand and Isabella, the Inquisition began. Muslims and Jews were forced to convert or flee. Books in Arabic were banned and burned, an act of cultural violence that wiped out centuries of accumulated knowledge. UNESCO records the 1499 burning of over 80,000 Arabic manuscripts in Granada alone. Even Arabic architecture, like the iconic Alhambra, was Christianized, symbols defaced, inscriptions removed or reinterpreted. What remained was either rebranded or ignored. Al-Andalus, once the soul of Iberia, became its forbidden memory. Today, when tourists visit Spain, they marvel at the Moorish arches and intricate tilework without knowing who the Moors were or what they built. Museums speak vaguely of Islamic influence, avoiding the names, philosophies, and dynasties that defined that era. To justify conquest and colonization, victors must delegitimize the conquered. And to claim a civilizational rise, Europe needed to deny it, ever borrowed from the East. Modern scholars, from Rosa Minical to Amira Benison, are now unearthing this lost legacy, reconstructing a history that was never meant to be forgotten. So, Al-Andalus was silenced, reduced to romantic ruins and Orientalist imagery. School curricula across Europe barely mention the role Al-Andalus played in preserving and transmitting classical knowledge. To the West, it is as if this 700-year chapter was too inconvenient for the national narratives that followed. But why? Why was such a rich and transformative history hidden? The answer lies in power, both political and epistemic. But the stones still whisper. The libraries may have burned, but some texts survive, smuggled to Cairo, Istanbul, and Timbuktu. And so, beneath the layers of tourist-friendly Spain, lies another country, one of light, tolerance, and brilliance. Cruelly erased. Imagine a time when the rest of Europe was shrouded in darkness, literally and intellectually. Muddy streets, unpaved alleys, and towns that went to sleep as the sun set. The Umayyad Caliphate had transformed it into a marvel of architecture, infrastructure, and intellect. It had over 500,000 residents, 3,000 mosques, 900 public baths, and 300 streets, all paved and lit. At night, travelers could walk safely through illuminated roads, guided by street lamps that wouldn't appear in Paris for another 700 years. No libraries, no plumbing, No scientific discourse. While London, Paris, and Rome were struggling with feudal wars and plagues, there existed a city bathed in light, not just from oil lamps, but from knowledge. That city was. These texts spanned medicine, mathematics, astronomy, literature, and translations of Greek, Persian, and Indian works. Scholars from across the Islamic world, and even Christian Europe, came here to study. They didn't just read, they debated, translated, and synthesized knowledge that would later fuel the European Renaissance. Without there might never have been a Da Vinci or a Galileo. By the 10th century, wasn't just the crown jewel of Al-Andalus. It was arguably the most advanced city in the world. But the true heart of wasn't its buildings, it was its libraries. The main royal library held over 400,000 volumes, at a time when the most prestigious Christian library in all of Europe had barely 400 books. What made so exceptional wasn't just quantity of knowledge, it was access to it. Women were educated. Non-Muslim scholars were allowed to write, teach, and debate. Jewish scholars like Hasdai ibn Shapret served in the caliph's court. Philosophers like Ibn challenged religious orthodoxy and laid the groundwork for secular thought centuries before the Enlightenment. This city was a symphony of intellectual voices, Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, all in harmony. Yet, like all golden ages, this one, too, began to dim. Political fragmentation, internal power struggles, and the growing pressure from northern Christian kingdoms weakened Escript. By the time it fell in 1236 CE to Ferdinand III of Castile, the city had already begun its descent. But what happened after the conquest was far more tragic. Libraries were looted, manuscripts burned, Islamic scholars fled or were silenced. The Inquisition hadn't even begun, but the erasure of memory had. The victors didn't just take the city, they rewrote its soul. Mosques were converted to cathedrals. Arabic inscriptions were chiseled off or reinterpreted. As Christian symbol, the city that once stood as a lighthouse for humanity was forcibly dimmed. But if you walk through today, echoes remain. The Mesquita Cathedral, with its forest of red and white arches, still whispers tales of its dual identity. Tour guides may downplay the Islamic origin, but the architecture defies silence. The very stones speak. And so, the question remains. If it was so central to Europe's rebirth, why did Europe pretend it never existed? As the tides of Christian conquest swept across the Iberian Peninsula, one city stood defiantly against the rising storm. Tucked into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, it wasn't just a city, it was the final frontier of a civilization gasping for air. After the fall of Seville and Valencia, Granada became the last Muslim kingdom in Europe. A fragile flame, still flickering in the darkness that was descending across a land. For over 2 centuries, the Nasrid dynasty held Granada as a jewel of resistance, culture, and splendor. It wasn't just survival, it was brilliance under siege. The Christian Reconquista had become not just a military campaign, it was a crusade of identity, one that wouldn't be satisfied until every trace of Muslim rule was erased. Yet, Granada survived. For 250 years. Granada, during this twilight period, saw the creation of one of the world's most magnificent architectural marvels. The Alhambra, a palace complex that seemed more like a dream than stone. Delicate stucco walls, inscribed with Arabic poetry, endlessly flowing fountains, and mathematical symmetry that left European architects dumbfounded. The Alhambra wasn't just a home for kings, it was a declaration. Even in our final hour, we will create beauty. But while Granada shined outwardly, pressure mounted from within and beyond. The answer lies in diplomacy, strategic marriages, tributes, and internal compromise. The Nasrid rulers agreed to pay yearly tributes to Castile, a financial surrender to buy time. But time was running out. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile unified Christian forces under one ruthless banner. With the Reconquista mission now fully weaponized by both faith and politics, the siege of Granada began. It wasn't just a city they wanted, it was a symbol, a final nail in the coffin of Muslim Europe. By the late 15th century, Spain was transforming. On January 2, 1492, under immense pressure, Emir Muhammad XII handed over the keys of Granada. The handover is romanticized in Spanish history, with Isabella and Ferdinand depicted as noble conquerors. But the truth was, anything but noble. But within a few years, every clause was broken. Mosques were closed. Arabic was outlawed. Forced conversions began. And then, the fires started. The surrender treaty promised tolerance, religious freedom, and protection for the Muslim population. Led by Cardinal Cisneros, over 80,000 Arabic manuscripts were piled into public squares and set ablaze. Medical texts, astronomical charts, philosophical treatises, centuries of thought and science turned to ash. The Inquisition began shortly after. Those who refused to convert faced imprisonment, torture, exile, or execution. A civilization was not just defeated, it was erased. It was the end of pluralistic Europe, the end of a continent where Muslims, Jews, and Christians once coexisted under law and light. After 1492, Spain would export conquest to the New World. But before it conquered others, it had already conquered memory, rewriting its past, burying its brilliance, and branding Al-Andalus as a mere footnote of foreign occupation. 1499, the burning of knowledge. And yet, the Alhambra remained, a tomb of a fallen world. The Arabic inscriptions still cling to the walls, despite centuries of attempts to Christianize the space. One phrase repeats often. Today, millions of tourists walk its silent halls, marveling at its arches and whispering fountains, often unaware that they are stepping inside a mausoleum. While at Khalil, there is no victor but God. Granada's fall wasn't just the end of Muslim Spain, but beneath the dust, Granada still breathes. The stones still whisper, the fountains still mourn. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the echo of a lost empire saying, "We were here. We built this. We were light before the darkness came." After the fall of Granada in 1492, you might expect peace. After all, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, had promised it. In official surrender documents, they guaranteed Muslims the right to practice their religion, retain their culture, and live without fear. But what followed wasn't peace. It was persecution in disguise. Public trials known as autos da were held in city squares. Spectacles of terror where supposed heretics were paraded, humiliated, and burned alive. The Catholic Church claimed it was purifying souls. In truth, it was cleansing culture, removing every remnant of Islamic heritage from the soil of Spain. The doors to Europe's darkest machinery were about to open, and its name was the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't merely a religious tribunal. It was an instrument of total erasure, of identity, culture, memory, and history. Though originally aimed at converted Jews suspected of secretly practicing Judaism, its net quickly expanded. Muslims who had accepted Christianity to avoid exile or execution, the Moriscos, now found themselves under the same brutal gaze. If they spoke Arabic, wore traditional clothes, refused pork, or even bathed too often, they were labeled as heretics. And what happens to a heretic? Torture, confession, trial, punishment. But before they could flee, much of their intellectual legacy was already turned to smoke. In Icen Cardinal Francisco de Cisneros led the mass burning of Arabic manuscripts in Granada. These weren't war documents or propaganda, they were texts on medicine, astronomy, agriculture, mathematics, philosophy, and poetry. Thousands were dragged from their homes in the dead of night. Works that had been preserved for centuries, copied lovingly by scholars across the Islamic world, and that had helped Europe crawl out of the Dark Ages, were reduced to ash. In the process, Europe didn't just destroy books. It severed its own intellectual lineage. But this wasn't just a physical extermination, it was an assault on knowledge. By 1502, all Muslims in Spain were ordered to convert or leave. In a single campaign, over 80,000 manuscripts were publicly burned in the squares of Granada, one of the largest cultural genocides in human history. So why did they do it? Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about who controls the story. The Christian monarchs didn't just want to rule Spain, they wanted to own its past, to erase anything that challenged the myth of Christian Europe's supremacy. Al-Andalus had proven that Muslims could govern with justice, build architectural marvels, lead scientific revolutions, and foster pluralistic societies. That truth was a threat. So the Inquisition became more than a religious war. It was epistemicide, the murder of knowledge. Arabic was banned. Speaking or reading, it became a punishable offense. Names were changed. Mosques were defaced or converted into churches. Even the call to prayer, the danhan which once echoed through in Granada, was silenced forever. Children were taught to be ashamed of their heritage, to forget the names of their ancestors. The architecture stood, yes, but it was now labeled Moorish style. The very word Moor became an empty, exotic label, detached from its African, Arab, and Berber origins. And centuries later, when European philosophers rediscovered lost Greek texts during the Renaissance, they were shocked to find Arabic annotations, footnotes written by Muslim scholars from Al-Andalus who had preserved, debated, and improved upon those very works. It was like building the pyramids and calling them fancy triangles, or marvel at the Moorish design of a palace. Ask yourself, to forget that their blood carried the DNA of astronomers, poets, philosophers, and architects. And slowly, it worked. By the 17th century, almost no traces of the Islamic legacy remained in public memory. And yet, despite this deliberate erasure, whispers survived. A few texts were smuggled to the Ottoman Empire. Some scholars in Cairo, Damascus, and Timbuktu preserved fragments of Andalusi thought. Europe had forgotten, but the truth had not. Today, historians like Rosa Menachal, Amira Benison, and Tariq Ali have started to piece together the fragments. The mosaic of Al-Andalus is being rebuilt, not just as an Islamic past, but as a shared human legacy that Europe tried to bury but could never fully kill. So, the next time you walk through a Spanish cathedral that used to be a mosque, whose story are you standing in? And who was forced to forget it? When we think of the European Renaissance, names like Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo usually come to mind. Geniuses who seemingly sprung up out of nowhere, sparking a rebirth of art and science after the Dark Ages. But the true roots of this awakening run far deeper, stretching across the Mediterranean to the golden cities of Al-Andalus, where knowledge had been preserved, cultivated, and transmitted. For centuries, Europe had been in intellectual stagnation. The fall of the Western Roman Empire plunged the continent into chaos and cultural decline. Libraries were lost, learning centers destroyed, and much classical knowledge, philosophy, medicine, mathematics vanished from common memory. Al-Andalus became the crucial bridge. Muslim scholars in cities like Toledo not only preserved ancient Greek, Roman, and Indian texts by translating them into Arabic, but also made groundbreaking advancements of their own. The works of Aristotle, Plato, and Ptolemy were translated and commented upon, providing a foundation for new scientific inquiry. In the 12th and 13th centuries, as Christian kingdoms reconquered parts of Spain, the school of translators in Toledo emerged as a vital hub. Here, Arabic texts were rendered into Latin and Hebrew, making this knowledge accessible to European scholars for the first time in centuries. Figures like Gerard of Cremona played a key role in transferring this treasure trove of knowledge. The influence of Andalusian thought can be traced through the work of European intellectual giants. Without the preservation and transmission of knowledge from Europe's so-called rebirth might have never occurred, or at least would have been delayed by centuries. Thomas Aquinas integrated the philosophy of Ibn Rushd, harmonizing reason with faith. Roger Bacon advanced scientific methods inspired by Islamic experimentation. The mathematical concept of algebra revolutionized European mathematics. Medical texts from Avicenna and Al-Zarawi informed European medicine for centuries. This intellectual inheritance laid the groundwork for the Renaissance's explosion in arts, science, and philosophy. Yet, this debt was rarely acknowledged. Europe preferred to tell a story of its own genius, conveniently overlooking the contributions of Muslim scholars. The legacy of Al-Andalus was quietly buried under myths of the Dark Ages and Christian superiority. But today, scholars are revisiting these narratives, highlighting the multicultural and interconnected nature of knowledge. Al-Andalus stands as a testament to the power of coexistence, scholarship, and cultural exchange, and a reminder that history is never as simple as the victors would have us believe. So, when you think of the Renaissance, remember this. It was not just a European phenomenon, it was a continuation of a rich legacy from a civilization that once shone brightly in the heart of Spain, a legacy that was erased but never truly extinguished.